Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hopping on today and joining us for our Faith Leaders webinar on Yemen. Um, really appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully, we'll get everyone out in a timely manner with a lot of great information and perspective, and really getting you up to speed on kind of what has happened since most of you are here because you signed a letter of 100 faith leaders from all 50 states speaking out about this horrible crisis in Yemen. And so we're here to kind of update you on that campaign, give a little more of a deep dive into context to why it is we're advocating and calling for this policy change, and also giving you kind of some concrete next steps as well. So to start off, I just want to introduce myself and a colleague. If we can go to the next slide. So my name, which unfortunately you don't see a face to because I had some travel challenges, but my name is John Gromek. I'm the interim regional organizer for the Southeast at Bread for the World. So you'll get to hear my dulcet tones as we navigate and manage this webinar. And I'll also have some great support from colleague Zach Schmidt, who is the senior regional organizer in the Midwest for Bread for the World as well. So a couple of housekeeping points just to get us started. You'll see on your screen there are kind of two buttons or functions. One is a Q&A, and the other is a chat button. So Zach and I are going to be monitoring those. If anytime throughout this webinar you have you're having a problem or you can't hear something more logistics-wise, just shoot a chat. We'll monitor that and try to solve it. There are going to be a couple of opportunities where you get to hear from some of our resident experts on this, where we'll provide some time for Q&A for a bit. If you have questions that percolate as you're listening, things you want to clarify, ask them through that Q&A tab, and we'll get to see that, and we will try to either answer it live as we're going, or we'll save that question as best we can for afterwards. All right, so housekeeping aside, and also just as a point of reference, so just because when you get so many people on a webinar, it gets really hard to handle muting, unmuting folks, so everyone is pretty much muted on this call except the speakers and panelists we have. So if you do want to communicate something, please do it through that Q&A or chat function. All right, but why don't we go ahead and get started, ground ourselves in some prayer. Zach, would you mind moving to, we'll do a little jujitsu. There we go. Giver of life, who hears the cries from Yemen of mothers choosing between medicine or food, of parents grieving children lost to starvation, of those who have given up everything in hunger. Hear our cries for hope, for change, and for peace. In your mercy, break political deadlocks, soften hardened hearts, change closed minds, and open unhearing ears. Let people come before power. Let life be holy again. And let your justice and peace shape the nation of Yemen and the lives of all people. Amen. All right. Thank you. So I'm sorry, Zach, if we could go back to the agenda slide. So just a quick run through before we get started in earnest. So we have done our prayer. Next, I will give a brief overview of this campaign and our work on this issue so far. And then we're going to have one of your fellow clergy give a brief testimony as to why he chose to do his faithful advocacy on this issue. And then we'll have some time to hear again from some great experts we have on both on staff at Bread for the World and with our partner organization. So we're going to welcome Scott Paul from Oxfam America, who's going to help give us a deep dive around just the crisis in Yemen and a lot of the background behind that. And then Jordan is going to speak to kind of the current political realities and give a strong legislative update and help us catch up to where we are right now and why this letter that we've pulled together with all your names and the advocacy we're going to do around that matters so much at this moment. And next, before we all leave, we want to give you all some next steps, give you some updates as to what's going to happen with this letter you all signed, how we're hopefully going to use it to drum up some more support and action around this issue in Congress, and how you can continue to raise your voice moving forward. All right, so let's get started. Let's start with our overview of the campaign after our prayer. Zach? One more? There we go. Give everyone a little sneak preview. So again, this campaign has really been born through some work and effort and advocacy going on more than a year now. So sadly, this crisis that has been unfolding in Yemen for some time is really now the world's deepest humanitarian crisis currently. We're at a place right now where nearly half of Yemen's 29 million people are now subsisting solely on global food aid. 7 million children younger than 5 are considered high risk of life-threatening malnutrition. And even those who survive live with the devastating impacts that their health and development have been inflicted upon them for the rest of their lives. And Bread for the World comes to this space certainly as a longtime organization and advocate for addressing and ending hunger in our world. But we also recognize this space is slightly unique for many of you who have been faithful advocates with Bread for the World for some time. And that, as you saw in the letter most of you signed on to, our ask is a little different in that the policy solution we're asking for is actually specifically addressing an end to military aid and funding. That's because what we know and have seen from looking at this crisis and how it affects the people of Yemen is that it is unique and that it is solely man-made. The largest and most distinct driver of malnutrition, of hunger, of poverty is solely due to war. So we know to address hunger, to address poverty, we also have to work for peace. And this is why we're coming together in this moment to raise your unique voices as clergy and faith leaders, because the unique roles of leadership you play in your community and in your judicatories and your faith traditions, to really help lift up this issue that unfortunately has gone on far, far too long. And has affected the lives, as we said, of millions and millions of people. So in this moment, we see some opportunity after some frustrations last year with the president vetoing some solutions to this crisis. So we're hoping to charge this advocacy effort once again, and especially through your voices and your names, with ours to help bring some attention to this very important issue. And we thought next, to kind of ground us and why we're all here, we wanted to invite one of your colleagues and one of our great Bread for the World leaders to, as a pastor, as a colleague of many of yours, to hear what brought him to raise his voice and to add his name to the other 99 pastors, clergy, and faith leaders from around the country calling to an end to this war. So I want to introduce Reverend Dave Burstetta from outside Chicago and Woodridge, Illinois, Woodridge UMC, to just share some thoughts and reflection and prayers with us at this moment. So thank you, Dave.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on, guys. When Zach asked me to sign on, I realized effectively I know nothing about Yemen. I guess if you push me, I'd say, well, I know that it shows up as a headline on like page 17 or something of the newspaper, and yeah, I'm old. I still get an actual newspaper, but I probably don't read those articles very often. Certainly not as often as I should. And if I pushed a little further, I could tell you, well, I'm pretty sure Yemen was played for laughs when Chandler went there on an episode of Friends like 20 years ago. But other than that, I don't really know anything about Yemen or Yemeni politics. But so it's certainly not coming at this from some sort of expertise. But I do know Bread for the World, and I trust Bread. After I think about 15 years as a Bread member and as a participant in many offerings of letters and other campaigns, I trust Bread to offer well-reasoned, theologically sound analysis. Basically, when Bread says an issue is important, I listen. So I don't know much, but I do know that if Jesus is, as we purport, the Prince of Peace, then 200,000 plus deaths due to war in Yemen is obviously 200,000 plus too many. And if Jesus is, as we purport, the bread of life, then 1 million children hungry in Yemen is 1 million too many. So I guess I signed this letter because, as I understand it, our ultimate calling is to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And I've found over the years, including in this instance, that partnering with Bread for the World helps me to do that, helps me to love neighbors better than I can on my own. So I very much appreciate the work that Bread does and an opportunity to lift my voice in this way.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Pastor Dave, for your thoughtful reflection. And I think to be honest, your experience is very similar to many of ours, including mine until more recently. And I think that speaks to why we need to be here in this moment, raising our voices. This is an issue that, despite its truly horrific and gut-wrenching nature, that sees the erasure of the dignity and humanity of our fellow human beings in Christ. It's something far too many people, including a lot of us on this call, don't know nearly enough about. And I think that certainly goes to our members of Congress as well. And even if they do know, they don't know nearly as much as they should how much their constituents and people back home do care about it. As Mr. Dave said, even if we may not be experts, we know in the heart of our hearts that the injustices that are being perpetrated, the experience of people in Yemen, are certainly not the kingdom God calls us to build. So getting here because our faith calls us to is a good start, but we also want to make sure we do spend some time making sure we are all a little more educated and have a little more background on this really important issue. So with that, I want to take a moment to introduce our colleague and friend from Oxfam. Zach, can we move to the next slide? I want to take a minute just to introduce Scott to this webinar. So Scott Paul leads Oxfam America's policy advocacy on, honestly, a number of emergencies and cross-cutting humanitarian issues, including Yemen. So during his time at Oxfam, Paul's gotten to spearhead a lot of the organization's work on acute crises like those in Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. So his advocacy in these emergencies often focuses on the political drivers of that violence and vulnerability, as we talked about, as well as often the financial exclusion of vulnerable populations and the remittance of companies and charities that serve them. So before joining Oxfam, Paul was a UN representative for Civic and led campaigns for Citizens for Global Solutions to strengthen the U.S. government's commitment to international cooperation and the rule of law. As a student and young professional, he was also the co-founder and the first chair of Sustain Us. Paul graduated from the New York University Law School and did his undergraduate work at Columbia University and St. Petersburg State University as well. So Scott, we are so grateful to have you here with us today, and without further ado, want to pass it on to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the introduction and the first part of this call. I have to say, I feel very fulfilled as a humanitarian advocate, being the person responsible for connecting all of you who are pursuing faithful advocacy with the stories and testimonies and demands that I encounter during my visits to Yemen. I think that's at its core what I want to be doing in fulfillment of my own humanitarian mandate is connecting people who want to be able to hear each other and hear and understand their needs and desires and rights, and how they want to assert those rights, and are interrupted by political systems and communications mechanisms and geographies that make that much more difficult. So what I want to do in the short time we have together is give you a very general sense of the conflict in Yemen, how it's come about, how it has created the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and then give you a sense of what that looks like for families and communities and people who are suffering through it, and what they are asking of us and what they expect of our country. And on a personal note, I'll just say I've been really moved in my trips to Yemen. Yemen is full of people who I identify with deeply on a personal level and who are intensely proud of their country, of their families and communities, and want desperately to be able to enjoy a full set of human rights, as many of us are blessed to enjoy. So how did we get here? Yemen has a long history that I could not possibly do justice to, first and foremost because of lack of expertise. But for our purposes, I think it suffices to know that Yemen was an autocratic country for a very long time, up until the Arab Spring revolutions, at which point its longtime dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was overthrown, and a transitional process was put in place, and a transitional government was put in place to usher in a new era of democracy for Yemen. Unfortunately, that process itself was deeply shaken by protests and concerns from a number of different quarters, and one of the groups that felt both sort of tuned out and pushed out from that process, and also felt it had an opportunity to claim power for itself, was a group called the Houthis, who are a historically marginalized group from the north, or represent many historically marginalized groups from the north of Yemen. And the Houthis essentially pushed out this transitional government out of the country, pushed it to Saudi Arabia, where it requested international assistance to fight back against the Houthis. So that's a very, very, very short and basic summary. But the main thing I want to communicate here is this is first and foremost a conflict that is driven by Yemenis' the desires and aspirations and concerns of Yemenis first and foremost, and has then been amplified and in many ways perverted out of recognition by the entrance into this conflict by other countries. The Houthis for themselves have aligned themselves with Iran, but they are not, as you might read in the press, Iranian proxies any more than Saudi Arabia, which is and the United Arab Emirates, who are fighting this war with American support, are American proxies. They're a complex set of actors, each with their own interests, and at its heart, there are a set of Yemeni groups who need to find a way to share power, and most of all, create space for Yemeni civil society, and in particular women and youth who are trying to build a better country for themselves and for their children. So as this conflict has expanded, what's basically happened is the combination of violence and economic collapse has created the world's largest humanitarian crisis. It's extraordinarily complicated, and the way I try to break it down for people is to try to condense it into 4 words that begin with the letter I. So if you remember these 4 I's, you'll have a very basic sense of why people are suffering and be able to explain it to others. So the first of the 4 I's is institutions. here we're talking mostly about government institutions and what happened when the Houthis pushed the government out of Sana'a, and then the government essentially went to Riyadh and then came back to the south and claimed the mandate to exercise government functions, is that the ministries of government and its central bank all got split. And as a result, a lot of these institutions ceased to be able to function. So you have a ton of schools not functioning anymore, a ton of hospitals, and most of all, you have a quarter of all Yemeni families who were supported by government salaries haven't gotten those salaries in about 4 years now, 3.5 years. So it's a major income stream and a major service provider that's essentially out of commission. So the first I is institutions. The second is infrastructure. And here we're talking about large-scale civilian economic infrastructure. To make that more concrete, schools, hospitals, roads, markets, bridges, ports, also sometimes big factories that employ a lot of people. And this infrastructure has been destroyed by the fighting. Majority of it has been destroyed by Saudi-led coalition bombs that are supplied by and supported by the United States government. And so that has also crippled the economy and crippled service provision throughout the country. The third I is imports. Yemen is an extraordinarily import-dependent country. It depends on imports to provide most of its food and most of its fuel. And the Saudi-led coalition has set up what we've called for quite a long time a de facto blockade, which essentially is a secondary set of inspections that ultimately let most goods into the country, but after imposing these extraordinarily costly delays that increase the price of consumer goods. So you have that, plus you have corruption on both sides, on many different sides, I should say, that are taking more and more money out of importers, out of businesses, and all of that gets passed on to consumers. The last I, so you've got institutions, infrastructure, imports. The last I is inequality. Inequality is Yemen's baseline condition. And it's important to understand that before this conflict, this phase of Yemen's conflict started in 2015, Yemen was one of the most unequal countries in the world and one of the most unequal in an extraordinarily unequal region. So these days, if you have money, you can buy more or less anything that you need in Yemen. When I go to Yemen and I go to a supermarket, you know, it's as full as, depending on where you are, it's as full as your Wegmans or your Trader Joe's or your Whole Foods, or name your high-end supermarket. You can find your high-end stocked consumer good in a supermarket in Yemen, but you probably can't afford it if you're part of the 90% of the population that lives in acute poverty. So all of this together conspires to create this humanitarian situation. You've got people who aren't being paid. You've got an economy that has spiraled out of control for now 4 years. And you've got prices that have gone up and up and up and up. So people are making less money. Inflation has made that money worth less and less. And people need to buy goods that are more and more expensive. So when you see the picture of a Yemeni child in a newspaper who looks emaciated, who looks like he or she hasn't eaten in many, many weeks, it's important to sort of zoom out and think about and bear in mind what that child's situation looks like, what he or she is living through, what their family is living through. In all likelihood, that child lives in a village with abundant food. In all likelihood, that child has parents who have had to make impossible choices. And it's important for me to stress this. Humanitarian crises affect people who have choices, but the choices get worse and worse and more heart-wrenching. So if you're a parent of one of those children whose papers appears in the pictures in the newspaper, you're probably thinking, I have another daughter, and I want that daughter to be educated and empowered, but if I accept a marriage proposal for that daughter, even if she's 10 years old, maybe that's enough to save her life and the lives of all of my other children. Or if I have a young son, maybe 12, 13 years old, maybe if I say my son can go and fight with one of the militias, he'll be able to earn enough to support the rest of us, including my other 4 children. These are the kinds of impossible choices that Yemenis are making every single day. So when I go to Yemen and I ask, so what do you want us to do about all of this? What is your demand of us? I've talked to probably a few hundred people over the past few years in Yemen and asked that question. I've interviewed on an individual basis a few dozen people. It's eerie that essentially every single person says a variation of the same thing. End the war. End the war. And when they say that, they don't mean everybody put down your guns and stop fighting and sign a big comprehensive peace deal, because sadly, we're really pretty far away from that. But what they mean is help make the main parties, and in particular, the parties fighting this international war, the Houthis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and all of their supporters, make them agree on a way to make life function like normal again. So no more bombing of our neighborhoods, no more bombing of our service providers, and some sort of reconciliation to let the government function again, to help bring prices down, to help us find a job and go back home to wherever we've been displaced from. And often a lot of my job consists of trying to find a way to translate those wishes and desires and demands into coherent U.S. government policy that Oxfam and others asks for. In this case, it's extremely clear, because under 2 administrations and for more than 4 years, the U.S. government has provided the bombs and offered the diplomatic, logistical, and intelligence support to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to fight this war. And it's this unconditional, indefinite support to one side of the conflict, while at the same time calling for peace, that has so frustrated all of the parties' efforts to try to get over the line and achieve that agreement. And I do want to stress it affects all of them. It's not just the Saudis and Emiratis, it's also the Houthis, who on one hand are saying, maybe we can make peace, maybe we don't want to make peace, but if the international community led by the United States and which is calling for peace is going to continue to arm one side of this, the other side, how can I possibly trust that I can achieve my aims through a peaceful negotiation? So our task is this: find ways to demonstrate that this military support to one side of the coalition isn't going to continue. And we're going to talk to you about some different ways we can do that right now. This is really the pivotal moment that we've been working in our advocacy for many, many years to get to.
Great. Scott, thank you so much for sharing that and helping to put a little different of a lens on probably what we just see in the news all the time or scan headlines with. Do you want us just offer up a little time right now? Certainly folks could have been inputting some questions if they had them in the moment, but if folks want to toss any questions out through that Q&A function on your screen, please feel free to do so. And if, of course, this goes without saying, if maybe 20 minutes after this webinar you think, oh shoot, I had a question I wanted to ask, you'll see my email up at the end. Many of you have been communicating with me via email. Please feel free to send it and we will do our best to get it answered. So we'll just give a few moments, see if there are any questions, and if not, we will continue on. Okay, well, that question box will still be open the rest of the webinar. If something comes to mind, we'll try to create some more space for folks to get those answered. But let's move on. So Scott mentioned, we're in this crux of a moment now where there's some really good opportunity to make some positive change on this issue. So we want to Here next, a little legislative update. If we can go to the next slide, and invite our colleague from Bread for the World, Jordan, to kind of give an update on where things are right now, especially as we set the stage to do some advocacy and action with this letter. Jordan?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, John. And thank you, Scott. I do not envy your task of boiling Yemen down to that concise of a 20 minutes. It's extremely complicated, and I really appreciate how concise and knowledgeable you are on that subject. So as Scott was saying, where we are to this point in this legislation has taken years and years of advocacy of bringing this up. And I want to give you a brief history of why we are choosing this vehicle in coming up in the next few weeks, and give you a history of how did we get to this point. So as Yemen has become a bigger and bigger issue, I'm going to take it back to last fall, when the House passed a War Powers Act that was trying to address the ending of all support to U.S. The end of all U.S. support to the Saudi and Emirati coalition. That passed out of the House, and later, when it was supposed to be brought up in the Senate, it was ruled out due to a technicality. There was a change in the rules, and it was ended in December. But there was sense of advocacy building on this. After years and years, we are getting legislation passed that were going to address the U.S. involvement in this conflict. Then again, this spring, we saw the passing of SJ Res 7, which came out of the Senate, and passed on a bipartisan support at 54 votes to 46 votes. It was very similar to the legislation that passed in the fall. It was centered around a War Powers Act. If you take it back to your history class, Congress must authorize any hostilities or any acts of war. This legislation was making the argument that we are engaged in hostilities in Yemen because of our munitions and logistical support. This passed with bipartisan support, and it forced the president to produce his first veto of the 116th Congress in, I think that was in May that occurred. And it went back to the Senate, and without the 67 votes that it needed to override the veto, the legislation died. So as we've been looking forward to other ways to produce legislation that could pass, that could address this, it's a little bit complicated if you're not able to do it through a War Powers Act. The next vehicle that advocates started looking at was the National Defense Authorization Act, which passes every year, and it specifies the annual budget and expenditures for the U.S. Department of Defense. And to bring you up to speed on where things are in Washington with the NDAA, as we call it, it has passed the Senate. The Senate has passed their version of the bill, which makes no mention of the conflict in Yemen. And the House has passed their version of the bill, which has three really important amendments, which we're going to be looking at. There is the Schiff and Jayapal amendment, which was introduced in the House and passed with 240 votes. It's very similar to the War Powers Act. It says that the U.S. is not allowed and must end all support, all logistical munitions, all support to the Saudi and Emirati coalition. There is another amendment put forward by Representative Malinowski, which is basically a weapons ban. It has a one-year weapons ban on all munition sales and transfers, and that passed in the House with 236 votes. And then there's the Lou Gabbard amendment, which strengthens some of the other amendments and calls for the ending of transfers and munitions. We really are pushing forward on the Schiff Smith, Kahan, and Jayapal amendment because it is the most comprehensive. It says what you guys said in your in the letter, that the U.S. must end all arms sales and support for the Saudi and Emirati coalition. So now, as the Senate and the House come together to conference to negotiate what should be held in each bill, it is really a key time to push the Senate on making sure these amendments are included in the final bill. When I was talking to some people that have had meetings on the Hill recently, they say that about 95% of the NDAA is finished. But there are sticking points, and this Yemen issue is a huge sticking point. It's down to the 4 main members that are looking at this: Jack Reed, Adam Smith, Imhoff, and Risch are kind of the key members that are taking a look at this legislation. And some members are saying, you know, we've had your vote on this, we've had legislation, it was vetoed, let's move forward without it. And then other advocates that have been working on this a long time are saying, no, this is really important. This needs to be decided now. So we are hoping to see that the NDAA is moved. Sometimes it's hard to say, but I think hopefully we could see some movement by the end of October, and we should see something moving in the next couple of weeks. However this goes, whenever we've seen legislation that has either passed or been vetoed, passed the House or Senate, we have seen responses in the international sense and in the domestic sense. When the Senate passed its bill calling for the end of U.S. involvement, we did see the administration pull back on some of its support and stopped in-air refuelings of planes, lessening the range capabilities of Saudi planes that were making bomb runs in Yemen. In the same sense, when the House passed their bill in December, just weeks after, we saw the Saudi Emirati coalition, the Houthis, come together to have peace talks in Oslo. Some of those ceasefire talks turned out well, and some the agreement was tenuous, but we did see progress. So the U.S. is the major leader in this, and they have a lot of leverage. That's why it's so important that we push members of Congress, especially this key conferencing time, to really emphasize and make sure that this is part of this larger package. And if there are any questions from the group, I would love to answer them.
Great. Maybe while folks are reflecting on a question they might want to ask Jordan, Scott, we did have a question that popped up later that I think would probably be best geared towards you. Someone asked, what, if any, humanitarian NGOs or government agencies are currently able to operate?
Yeah, I can answer that. It's actually quite a lot of humanitarian NGOs, but we face extraordinary constraints, bureaucratic impediments, threats, intimidation, and from all sides. Oxfam has reached a bit more than 3.5 million people with life-saving humanitarian assistance in the past few years. The organizations based in the U.S. that we work with most closely would be Save the Children, CARE, Norwegian Refugee Council, Mercy Corps, International Rescue Committee, Islamic Relief, and a number of others. So we're all able to operate there, but it's extremely difficult. Governments have not been able to operate, at least there are a few governments that can work there. It's questionable whether they are very effective in providing relief. Like, for example, the Emirati government is working there through the Red Cross, but its assistance is pretty problematic, actually. The United States, for example, has not maintained its embassy in Sana'a, and it's instead operating a Yemen section out of its embassy in Saudi Arabia.
Great. And please join this this could be for both of you, honestly. And I know the context of this is, of course, that Bread for the World and all its advocacy work works very closely with a lot of different partner organizations, especially denominational entities and organizations as well. But someone had asked basically who else are we all working with, denominational policy groups and the like, as well in this fight.
Yeah, for sure. It's a huge coalition of religious voices, of non-religious voices that are working together on this. I'm not sure about the question asked about the Episcopal group. I'm not completely sure about that, but I know that I've been working with the Quakers, the Methodists, and a large amount of organizations. I can send out a letter that we signed on with other faith voices calling for the end of this. We Bread for the World led a national letter of organizations calling for the end of this. I don't remember all those off the top of my head, but I can be sure to send that out to the group.
That'd be great. Yeah, and all this to say, we'll be following up with everyone who was on this webinar, and especially those who expressed their interest but could not, with a lot of all these answered questions and other materials and references as well. There was one question about making sure we provide information on how to contact your representatives on this, and we are way ahead of you. That'll be part of the next steps we'll answer at the end. All right. Well, on that note, unless we have any pressing further questions, why don't we move on to our next slide?
Actually, is the line open? Could I just answer that one last question? Because I know it off the top of my head.
Oh, good. Please do.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the different amendments that are available. We support all of them. One thing I think is really important to keep in mind is that the sort of conceptual debate around war powers, which links to logistical support on one hand, and arms sales to the parties on the other, are actually on two different tracks, and the different amendments address each of them separately. The one that we're pushing really hard is called Section 1099X in the House bill. That's an amendment introduced by Congressman Malinowski, which would suspend the transfer of the worst, the most serially misused weapons, which are air-to-ground bombs, to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for 1 year.
Yeah, and that's why in the letter we did have kind of the loose language of talking about all arms and support for the Saudi Emirati coalition, so that we can support the Malinowski amendment, which is the most important on ours, but also that we can lend support if another one is prioritized over that, to the Schiff-Smith amendment as well. But thank you for explaining that a little bit more.
Great. Thank you guys so much. All right, next slide. So this is, as it stands now, the formal letter that we will actually be publishing in just 2 short days, less than that, honestly, the 17th. But as we mentioned, you all raised your prophetic voices and joined 99 of your other colleagues signing on to this letter. And so in addition to making sure we get this in front, directly in front of legislators and their offices, on the 17th, this letter is going to be published in the Washington Post. So it's obviously a paper that every office gets. It will be pretty prominently featured. So it's going to kind of be the opening salvo as to helping make sure we really amplify and push this message, driven by all of you as well. So like we said, in addition to the follow-up, this letter will be going out. We will be able to provide you a link just so you could see it live on the Washington Post website, hopefully on the 17th. So certainly look for that as well. And we just want to take a moment to say, again, thank you so much once again for answering this call. to raise your voice, to sign on. We can't say, at least I speak for all my colleagues at Bread who, were making phone calls, sending emails. It really was encouraging to see not just the 100 who were able to sign on, but honestly the more clergy and other faith leaders who express interest, but we're limited by the fact we wanted to get at least 2 from every state. So I know we have a deep bench of many faith leaders who expressed that willingness to stand up and speak truth to power on this. So we want to thank you so much for that. And next, we just wanted to provide you all with a little further context and next steps, where we're going from here, specifically about using this letter as a tool to really help gin up some awareness and support and hopefully move some hearts and minds in the next few weeks. So as we mentioned, kind of the next big step, this letter will be published in the Washington Post in a couple of days, so we'll send out that link. Brett and our partners are also making sure we try to get as much mileage as we can out of this amazing letter and support across the country, so definitely be shopping into other media outlets. We'll all be doing kind of our own press nationally just to continue drumming up the story. And we'll definitely keep you all abreast as those developments occur. In addition to that, we will have our staff on the ground in DC, as well as our other partners, are really going to be doing the work. Again, not just to making sure, obviously, every office on the Hill gets the Washington Post, but stopping by those offices, especially the most pressing legislators whose voices are really critical on this issue, just making sure they see this as well. So that's what's going to be done in Washington, D.C. in the next couple of days. Specifically where we need everyone's help. So again, we want to continue telling the story, raising awareness about, 100, more than 100 really, but 100 faith leaders who have stepped up and raised their voices to build awareness on this and calling our Congress to do the right thing. So we'll ask if you could all help to push this out on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, what have you. On one hand, just to make sure more people see it, especially within your own network, encouraging them to take action, but also specifically making sure through social media that your legislators' offices see this as well. So in the next couple of days, we're going to provide you kind of resources and toolkits and examples, so you can all do that, so you don't have to do it by yourself, obviously. So look for that as well. And as I mentioned, so we'll be doing a big push on the Hill in Congress the next few days and in the weeks to come. But also get ready to hear from us. In some cases, we might ask you, or maybe if there are some other colleagues in your state or possibly congressional district, to help us really push this in key states and again, congressional districts whose senators and representatives really matter and have kind of a strong voice on this. So we're going to be looking at places like Oklahoma, Idaho, South Carolina, Indiana, Utah, among some other places, just to help drive this point home and really make sure our legislators know about your voices that are being raised on this. And like Jordan said, I think we are in a strong crux of a moment where a lot can happen in the next few weeks. So we want to make sure, with this letter and your signatures and voices behind it, I think we can get a good start on that. So look from us, in addition to follow up from this webinar where we'll include this recording, we'll include a lot of the resources I mentioned as well, and we'll also make sure you have a link to the actual letter that will be published in just a couple of short days. Final slide. Yeah. And again, so many of you have heard from me via email as I've reached out to all the signers, but if you have any further questions, feel free to contact me, or if you have already been working with your Bread for the World organizer, feel free to reach out to them directly as well. But happy to help support everyone on this. And just once again, thank you so much for raising your voice, raising your hand, and we're so blessed and happy to have you with us as we advocate towards ending the largest humanitarian crisis in the world right now in the coming weeks. And with that, if folks have any final questions, happy to entertain those. Otherwise, feel free to contact us directly, and we'll happily close any loops. And again, we'll get everyone all the tools and specifics they need to continue to be advocates on this as we move forward. Okay. All right. Well, we'll let everyone go back to their regularly scheduled programming. But once again, we thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all our panelists and our speakers, and look forward to hearing from us soon. Have a blessed day.
Same to you. Thank you.